The dust clouds settled as the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Redemption Creek's main street. Martha Hendricks stepped down from the weathered stagecoach, her worn boots touching the sun-baked earth with quiet determination. At 72, she carried herself with the dignity of someone who had weathered many storms, though her black dress showed the fraying edges of hard times. The townspeople gathered on the wooden sidewalks, drawn by curiosity as much as boredom. In a town where excitement meant a new shipment of supplies or a traveling preacher, any stranger was worthy of attention. But this stranger, this elderly woman with silver hair pinned severely back and eyes that seemed to hold decades of unspoken words, drew a different kind of response. "Well, would you look at that?" chuckled Tom Bradley, the town's blacksmith, his massive arms crossed over his leather apron. "Looks like someone's grandmother got lost on her way to Sunday service." The laughter rippled through the crowd like wildfire. Even the children giggled behind their mothers' skirts, pointing at the old woman's simple dress and the small, battered suitcase she carried. Sheriff Jake Morrison emerged from his office, the afternoon light glinting off his badge. At 45, he was a man shaped by this harsh land, tall, lean, with weathered hands that had seen their share of difficult decisions. He'd kept peace in Redemption Creek for 8 years, earning respect through fairness and an unwavering sense of justice. "Ma'am," he said, tipping his hat respectfully as he approached Martha, "I'm Sheriff Morrison. Is there something I can help you with?" Martha's eyes met his, steel gray meeting warm brown. There was something in her gaze that made the laughter die in nearby throats, something that spoke of purpose beyond what her appearance suggested. "Sheriff Morrison," she said, her voice carrying the weight of years but none of their frailty. "I believe there is. I'm looking for information about events that took place here 30 years ago. Events involving the Whitmore family." The name fell like a stone into still water. Several townspeople exchanged glances, and the casual atmosphere shifted to something more uncomfortable. The Whitmores had been a respected ranching family, but their story had ended in tragedy that most preferred to leave buried. "The Whitmores," Sheriff Morrison repeated slowly. "Ma'am, that was before my time here. Most folks who remember them have either moved on or—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Well, it was a long time ago." "Not long enough," Martha replied quietly, her fingers tightening around the handle of her suitcase. "Some things, Sheriff, don't fade with time. Some things demand to be remembered." Doc Patterson, an elderly man who had served as the town's physician for over 4 decades, stepped forward from the crowd. His face had gone pale beneath his white whiskers. "Martha," he whispered, recognition dawning in his eyes. "Martha Whitmore." The murmurs that had been building in the crowd suddenly stopped. Even the wind seemed to pause, as if the very air was holding its breath. Martha turned to face the doctor, and for a moment the iron composure in her features softened with something that might have been old pain. "Hello, Daniel," she said simply. "I told you I'd come back one day." Sheriff Morrison felt the shift in the crowd's mood, from amusement to confusion to something approaching unease. The name Whitmore clearly meant more than he'd realized, and this woman's arrival was stirring up memories that some people preferred to keep buried. "Doc," he said quietly, "perhaps we should continue this conversation in my office." But Martha shook her head. "No, Sheriff. What I have to say has been hidden in offices and whispered in shadows for 30 years. It's time for the truth to see daylight." She reached into her suitcase and withdrew a leather folder, yellowed with age but carefully preserved. The sight of it made Doc Patterson take a step backward. "Martha, please," he whispered, "let the past stay buried." "The past," Martha said, her voice growing stronger, "has been buried long enough. My family's name has been buried long enough, and the truth—" She held the folder higher. "The truth deserves to be heard." Sheriff Morrison watched the interaction with growing concern. Whatever was in that folder, it was significant enough to bring this woman back after 3 decades, and powerful enough to make one of the town's most respected citizens look like he'd seen a ghost. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "why don't you tell me what this is about?" Martha's eyes swept across the assembled crowd. The same faces that had been laughing at her moments before, now silent and uncertain. When she spoke, her words carried across the street like a judgment. 30 years ago, Sheriff, my family owned the largest ranch in this county. My husband, Benjamin, my sons, Robert and Thomas, and my daughter-in-law, Eleanor. Good people, honest people. People who believed that hard work and integrity would see them through any storm. She paused, letting the weight of memory settle over the crowd. They were wrong. The folder in her hand seemed to grow heavier, and Sheriff Morrison could see that whatever was inside had been carried like a burden for 3 decades. They were destroyed by lies, Sheriff. Lies that cost them their land, their reputation, and ultimately their lives. And the men who told those lies. Her gaze swept across the crowd again, landing on several faces that had grown notably pale. Some of them are standing right here. As the sun began to sink toward the horizon, casting the town in shades of gold and shadow, Martha Whitmore stood in the street where her family had once walked with pride, holding the evidence that would either vindicate their memory or tear apart everything this town believed about its own past. The laughter had died completely now, replaced by a silence that felt heavy with the weight of long-buried secrets about to see the light. The Golden Nugget Saloon had never been quieter during evening hours. Men who usually filled the space with boisterous conversation sat hunched over their drinks, speaking in hushed tones. The arrival of Martha Whitmore had stirred something in Redemption Creek that many had hoped would stay buried forever. Sheriff Morrison sat at his desk, the leather folder Martha had shown him that afternoon lying unopened before him. She had retired to the town's only boarding house, promising to return in the morning to discuss the matter properly. But the sheriff found sleep impossible, his mind racing with questions about what secrets this folder might contain. A soft knock at his office door interrupted his thoughts. Doc Patterson entered without waiting for a response, his usually steady hands trembling slightly as he removed his hat. "Jake," he said quietly, settling into the chair across from the sheriff's desk. "We need to talk." "About Martha Whitmore? About what happened 30 years ago?" Doc's eyes fell on the folder. "About what really happened to the Whitmore family." Sheriff Morrison leaned back in his chair, studying the older man's face. In all his years in Redemption Creek, he had never seen Doc Patterson look so haunted. "I was hoping someone would fill me in," the sheriff said. "The way people reacted today, it's clear there's more to this story than anyone's been willing to share." Doc was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the darkened street. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of decades of guilt. "The Whitmores were good people, Jake. Benjamin was one of the finest men I ever knew, honest, hard-working, generous to a fault. When the drought hit in '94, he was the first to offer help to struggling neighbors. When the bank was foreclosing on the Miller farm, Benjamin paid their debt without being asked. Sounds like a pillar of the community. He was. That's what made what happened to them so unforgivable." Doc stood and walked to the window, his shoulders sagging under some invisible weight. There were men in this town who envied what Benjamin had built, men who saw opportunity in the family's generosity and good nature. When tensions with the local Apache bands were running high, these men saw a chance to destroy the Whitmores and profit from their downfall. Sheriff Morrison felt a chill run down his spine. What kind of opportunity? Benjamin had been working to establish peaceful trade relationships with the Apache. He believed that understanding and mutual respect could prevent the kind of violence that was tearing apart other parts of the territory. It was controversial, but it was working. Doc turned back to face the sheriff, and in the lamplight his face looked older than his 70 years. But there were men who profited from conflict, Jake. Men who sold weapons to both sides, who inflated supply prices during times of tension, who stood to gain from keeping the Apache and the settlers at each other's throats. And Benjamin Whitmore's peace efforts threatened that. Exactly. So they hatched a plan to destroy him and his family's reputation in one stroke. The door opened again, and Martha Whitmore entered quietly. Both men turned, surprised by her appearance. "Mrs. Whitmore," Sheriff Morrison said, rising from his chair. "I thought you were resting." "I've had 30 years to rest, Sheriff," she replied, her voice steady despite the late hour. "I've been listening from the hallway." "Doc Patterson, I'm glad you finally found the courage to speak the truth." Doc's face flushed with shame. "Martha, You were a young doctor then," she said, not unkindly. "You had a practice to protect, a future to consider. I understand why you stayed silent, but the silence has gone on long enough." She moved to the desk and placed her hand on the leather folder. "Tell him about the raid, Daniel." Doc closed his eyes, as if the words caused him physical pain. "They staged an Apache raid on the Henderson Ranch," he said quietly. "Made it look like Benjamin had betrayed the location to his Apache contacts. 3 people died in that raid, Jake. 3 innocent people murdered to frame a good man." Sheriff Morrison felt sick. "The evidence." "But they planted," Martha said simply. "Apache arrows with markings that supposedly came from Benjamin's trading partners. A letter forged in my husband's handwriting, giving details about the Henderson Ranch's defenses. It was all fabricated, but it was convincing enough. The town turned against them overnight," Doc continued. "Everything Benjamin had built, his reputation, his business relationships, his standing in the community, destroyed in a single day. The bank foreclosed on the ranch within a week. Other creditors followed suit." Martha's voice remained steady, but Sheriff Morrison could see the pain in her eyes as she continued the story. "My husband tried to fight the accusations, but who would believe him? The evidence seemed overwhelming. Within a month we had lost everything. Benjamin fell into despair, started drinking. Robert and Thomas, my sons, they couldn't find work anywhere. The shame was killing them all." "And then?" the sheriff asked, though he was beginning to suspect the tragic end to this story. "Benjamin died 6 months later," Martha said quietly. "Officially it was his heart. But I know better. It was shame and hopelessness that killed him. Robert died in a riding accident 3 weeks after his father's funeral, though I've always wondered if it was really an accident. Thomas lasted another year before he couldn't bear the weight anymore. He took his own life. The silence in the office was deafening. Sheriff Morrison stared at the folder, understanding now why its contents had remained hidden for so long. "Your daughter-in-law? Eleanor died of pneumonia the following winter, without proper medical care, without adequate shelter." Martha's voice trailed off. "I was the only one left, the only one to carry the truth." Doc Patterson slumped in his chair, looking like a man carrying an unbearable burden. "I knew, Jake," he whispered. "I knew the whole thing was a lie. I treated one of the men who staged the raid. He was injured during the attack and came to me for help. In his delirium, he admitted what they had done, but by then it was too late," Martha finished. "My family was already destroyed." Sheriff Morrison looked between the two of them, processing the magnitude of what he was hearing. "Who?" he asked simply. "Who was responsible?" Martha opened the folder and withdrew several documents. Pages of careful handwriting, witness statements, copies of forged documents, and what appeared to be a confession. "That," she said, "is what we'll discuss tomorrow, in public, in front of the whole town. It's time for Redemption Creek to confront its past, Sheriff, and it's time for justice, even if it comes 30 years late." As she prepared to leave, she paused at the door. "The men who destroyed my family thought they had buried the truth with them. They were wrong. Truth has a way of surviving, Sheriff, and tomorrow it's going to see the light of day." After she left, Sheriff Morrison and Doc Patterson sat in heavy silence, both men understanding that the morning would bring revelations that would shake Redemption Creek to its foundations. Outside, the wind whistled through the empty streets, carrying with it the weight of long-buried secrets about to be exposed. Dawn broke clear and cold over Redemption Creek, but Sheriff Morrison had been awake for hours, reading through the contents of Martha Whitmore's folder by lamplight. What he found there made his blood run cold and his sense of justice burn hot. The documents were meticulously organized, 30 years of careful investigation by a woman who had refused to let her family's memory die in shame. There were witness statements from people who had since moved away or died, copies of financial records showing suspicious transactions, and most damning of all, a detailed confession written by one of the conspirators on his deathbed. By 9 o'clock, word had spread through the town that Martha Whitmore had requested a public gathering at the town hall. Sheriff Morrison had agreed to facilitate the meeting, knowing that whatever was about to be revealed would change Redemption Creek forever. The hall filled quickly, with nearly every adult in town squeezing into the wooden pews and standing along the walls. The atmosphere was tense, charged with the nervous energy of people who sensed that long-held secrets were about to surface. Martha entered wearing the same black dress from the day before, but she carried herself with a dignity that commanded attention. The leather folder was tucked under her arm like a weapon of justice. Sheriff Morrison stood at the front of the room, his badge catching the morning light streaming through the windows. "Folks," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the packed hall, "Mrs. Whitmore has brought some serious allegations regarding events that took place in our town 30 years ago. I believe it's important that we hear what she has to say." A murmur ran through the crowd. Several men near the back shifted uncomfortably, their faces already showing signs of guilt or fear. Martha stepped forward, her grey eyes scanning the assembled townspeople with the authority of someone who had truth on her side. 30 years ago, she began, her voice strong and clear. "My family was destroyed by lies. My husband and sons died in shame, believing they had been branded as traitors and murderers. I was driven from this town with nothing but the clothes on my back and the certainty that justice had not been served." She opened the folder and withdrew the first document. "I've spent 3 decades gathering evidence, tracking down witnesses, and uncovering the truth about what really happened to the Whitmore family. And today, that truth will finally be heard." Mayor Henderson, a portly man in his 60s, stood up from the front row. His face had gone pale, and his hands were shaking. "Now see here, Mrs. Whitmore," he stammered. "I don't know what you think you've discovered, but—" "Sit down, Charles," Martha said quietly, and the authority in her voice made the mayor sink back into his seat like a scolded child. "The truth," Martha continued, "begins with greed. My husband Benjamin had built the most successful ranch in the county through hard work and honest dealing, but there were men in this town who wanted what he had, and they were willing to commit murder to get it." She held up a document, and Sheriff Morrison recognized it as the confession he had read earlier. "This is the deathbed confession of Samuel Tucker, written 5 years ago in Denver, Colorado. Samuel was dying of consumption and wanted to clear his conscience before he met his maker." Martha began to read from the document, her voice steady despite the emotional weight of the words. "I can't die with this sin on my soul. We killed innocent people to frame Benjamin Whitmore. Charles Henderson, Walter Briggs, Frank Morrison, and myself, we planned it all. We knew Benjamin was working for peace with the Apache, and we knew it would hurt our business interests if he succeeded." A gasp ran through the crowd. Frank Morrison had been the previous sheriff, Jake Morrison's predecessor, and the man who had recommended him for the position. "The confession continues," Martha said, raising her voice over the growing murmur. "We staged the raid on the Henderson Ranch, Charles's own property. We killed the Hendersons, Charles's own parents, to make it look convincing. We planted the evidence, forged the letters, and watched as a good man's life was destroyed by our lies." The crowd erupted in shocked voices and angry shouts. Several people turned to stare at Mayor Henderson, who had buried his face in his hands. Sheriff Morrison stepped forward, his own face pale with the realization that his mentor and predecessor had been a murderer. "Order!" he called out. "Let Mrs. Whitmore finish!" Martha waited for the noise to die down before continuing. "There's more," she said, withdrawing additional documents. Bank records showing how the conspirators divided up my family's land and assets among themselves. Witness statements from people who saw Frank Morrison planting evidence at our ranch. And this, she held up a final document, sealed with an official territorial seal. A full pardon for my family, issued by the territorial governor after I presented him with all the evidence. The Whitmore name has been officially cleared of all charges. The silence that followed was deafening. Every eye in the room was fixed on Martha as she stood there, vindicated at last, but at a cost that could never be repaid. Mayor Henderson slowly rose to his feet, his face wet with tears. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, his voice breaking, there's nothing I can say, nothing that can undo what we did." "You killed your own parents," Martha said quietly, her words cutting through the silence like a knife. "You murdered them in cold blood to frame my husband for a crime he would never have committed." Henderson nodded, unable to speak. Walter Briggs, the town's bank president, stood up from his seat near the middle of the hall. "It's true," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "God help us, it's all true. We were young and greedy, and we convinced ourselves that the end justified the means." Sheriff Morrison felt the weight of his badge pressing against his chest. His predecessor, the man who had trained him, the man he had respected and tried to emulate, had been a murderer and a fraud. With steady hands, he reached up and unpinned the badge from his shirt. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, his voice carrying across the silent hall, "I can't wear this badge knowing it was worn by a man who destroyed your family. I can't represent justice in a town built on such a fundamental injustice." He placed the badge on the table beside Martha's documents. "The town needs to decide how to move forward from here. But as for me, I can't be sheriff of a place where such evil was allowed to flourish unchallenged." Martha looked at the badge, then back at the sheriff who had just sacrificed his position for the sake of her family's honor. "Sheriff Morrison," she said quietly, "you are not responsible for the sins of your predecessor. And this town," she gestured to the crowd, many of whom were now weeping openly, "this town needs honest leadership now more than ever." She picked up the badge and held it out to him. "My family believed in justice, Sheriff. Real justice. The kind that protects the innocent and holds the guilty accountable, regardless of their position or influence. If you're willing to serve that kind of justice, then this badge belongs on your chest." Sheriff Morrison looked into her eyes and saw not hatred or revenge, but a deep, abiding faith in the possibility of redemption, not just for her family's reputation, but for the town itself. He took the badge from her hands and pinned it back to his shirt. "Then let's start cleaning up this mess," he said. As the crowd began to disperse, many people approached Martha to offer apologies, tears, and promises to help rebuild what had been torn down. The truth was finally out, and Redemption Creek would have to live up to its name in ways its founders never imagined. 3 months had passed since the day Martha Whitmore stood in the town hall and exposed the truth that had been buried for 30 years. Redemption Creek was a different place now, scarred by the revelation of its founders' crimes, but slowly beginning to heal under the weight of honest reckoning. Sheriff Morrison walked down the main street on a crisp autumn morning, observing the changes that had transformed the town. Where once there had been casual gossip and comfortable assumptions, there was now a more thoughtful, deliberate quality to daily life. People greeted each other with a newfound respect, as if the exposure of such fundamental injustice had reminded everyone of their shared humanity. The most visible change was taking place at the edge of town, where construction had begun on the Whitmore Memorial Community Center. The building was being funded by restitution payments from the estates of the conspirators and donations from townspeople who wanted to honor the family that had been so terribly wronged. Martha had remained in Redemption Creek, taking up residence in a small house near the schoolhouse. She had declined offers of more substantial accommodations, saying that she preferred simplicity after so many years of carrying her burden alone. Sheriff Morrison found her that morning in the town's cemetery, standing before a newly erected monument bearing the names of her husband and children. The inscription read, "The Whitmore family, innocent of all charges, forgive us our blindness." "Mrs. Whitmore," he said softly, removing his hat as he approached. She turned and smiled, something he had rarely seen her do since her arrival. The weight of vindication had lifted some of the hardness from her features, revealing traces of the gentle woman she might have been under different circumstances. "Sheriff," she replied. "Beautiful morning, isn't it?" "It is indeed." He stood beside her, looking at the monument. "How are you feeling about all this? The changes, I mean." Martha was quiet for a moment, her eyes fixed on her family's names carved in stone. 30 years ago, I left this town consumed with hatred, she said finally. I swore that I would return someday and make everyone pay for what they had done to my family. I spent decades imagining the revenge I would take, the suffering I would inflict in return. She paused, her voice softening. But standing here now, seeing how the truth has changed this place, I realize that revenge would have been hollow. What's happening now? The way people are confronting their past, the way they're working to build something better. This is what Benjamin would have wanted. Sheriff Morrison nodded, understanding the profound shift he was witnessing. Mayor Henderson resigned this morning, he said gently. The town council has called for new elections. I heard. How's he doing? As well as can be expected for a man who has to live with what he's done. He's liquidating his assets to contribute to the restitution fund. Says he wants to spend whatever time he has left trying to make amends. Martha sighed deeply. Redemption is possible for everyone, Sheriff, even for those who seem beyond forgiveness. My husband taught me that. They walked together toward the center of town, passing the construction site where the memorial center was taking shape. Workers called out respectful greetings to Martha, who had become something of a revered figure in the community. And there's something else I wanted to discuss with you, Sheriff Morrison said as they reached his office. The town council has approached me about establishing a new position, a community justice advocate, someone who would work to prevent the kind of injustice that happened to your family. Martha raised an eyebrow. And who did they have in mind for such a position? You, Mrs. Whitmore. They want you to help create a system that ensures the truth can't be buried again, that the powerless have a voice, that justice isn't determined by wealth or influence. Martha stopped walking and turned to face him fully. Sheriff, I'm 72 years old. I've spent most of my adult life carrying anger and seeking vindication. I'm not sure I'm the right person to... You're exactly the right person, he interrupted gently. You've seen what happens when good people stay silent in the face of evil. You've experienced the cost of injustice firsthand, and you've proven that truth, even buried truth, has the power to transform an entire community. They entered his office, where a young woman was waiting with a small child. She rose nervously as they entered. Sheriff Morrison, Mrs. Whitmore, I'm Sarah Collins. I wanted to thank you. Martha looked at the woman with curiosity. Thank me? I don't believe we've met. No, Mom, but your story, what you did, it gave me the courage to speak up about something that's been happening to my family. My husband, he's been... She struggled with the words, glancing down at her child. Sheriff Morrison stepped forward. Mrs. Collins came to me yesterday with allegations of domestic violence. She said that hearing about your fight for justice made her realize that she didn't have to suffer in silence. Martha's expression softened as she looked at the young woman and her child. Speaking the truth takes tremendous courage, especially when it concerns people we love, she said gently. How can I help? Sarah Collins began to cry quietly. I don't know how to start over. I don't know how to rebuild our lives, but you lost everything and found a way to fight back. You found a way to make things right. Martha reached out and took the young woman's hands in her own. "You've already taken the hardest step, dear one. The truth has been spoken. Now we build from there, one day at a time." As Sheriff Morrison watched Martha comforting Sarah Collins, he saw the emergence of something beautiful from the ashes of old tragedy. The woman who had returned to Redemption Creek, seeking justice, was becoming a source of hope and healing for others who faced their own struggles. Later that afternoon, as the sun cast long shadows across the town square, Martha stood before the partially completed memorial center. A small crowd had gathered for the ceremonial laying of the cornerstone, and she had been asked to speak. "My family came to this land with dreams," she began, her voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd. "They believed in hard work, honest dealing, and the possibility that people of different backgrounds could live together in peace. When they were destroyed by lies and greed, those dreams seemed to die with them." She paused, looking out at the faces before her, faces that now carried hope where once there had been only comfortable ignorance. "But today, I see those dreams taking root again. I see a community that has faced its darkest truths and chosen to build something better. I see people who understand that justice isn't just about punishment, it's about healing, about growth, about ensuring that future generations don't repeat the mistakes of the past." She placed her hand on the cornerstone, which bore an inscription from her husband's journals. "Truth is the foundation upon which all good things are built. This building will stand as a reminder that no truth is too buried to be found, no injustice too old to be addressed, and no community too broken to be healed. It will be a place where people can seek help, find their voice, and know that their stories matter." As the crowd dispersed, Martha found herself standing alone with Sheriff Morrison as the sun set behind the mountains. "So," he said quietly, "will you take the position? Will you help us build this new system of justice?" Martha smiled, and in that smile was the echo of the woman she had been before tragedy struck, combined with the wisdom and strength that had carried her through 30 years of seeking truth. "Sheriff," she said, "I think my husband would approve of one more fight. Not for revenge this time, but for redemption." She looked out over the town that had once driven her away in shame and now welcomed her as a guardian of justice. "Yes," she said firmly, "let's build something worth believing in." And as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Redemption Creek settled into evening, with the quiet satisfaction of a community that had faced its demons and chosen to be better. The old woman who had returned with memories and truth had become the foundation for a new beginning, proving that it's never too late for justice, never too late for healing, and never too late for redemption. The laughter that had once mocked her arrival had been replaced by something far more valuable: respect earned through courage, wisdom gained through suffering, and hope built on the unshakable foundation of truth. In the end, Martha Whitmore had not just cleared her family's name. She had given an entire town the chance to clear its conscience and build a future worthy of the dreams her family had once carried into this wild, beautiful, and ultimately redeemable land.